The air inside the federal courthouse in Chicago felt heavy, the kind of heavy that pressed against your ribs and made each breath feel deliberate. The mahogany benches creaked as family members shifted in their seats, all of them gathered as if this trial were just another social event. But I wasn't there as a spectator, at least not entirely. From the front, Assistant U.S. Attorney Madeleine Parker rose with the kind of confidence that drew every eye. She was sharp, every gesture precise, and when she paused, the silence spread like a chill. "The prosecution," she announced, her voice carrying easily across the courtroom, calls a final rebuttal witness. Deputy U.S. Marshal Emily Carter. That name, my name, hung in the air like a challenge. I caught the sharp intake of breath from my relatives behind me. Confusion rippled across their row, their murmurs clashing like nervous birds. But my eyes weren't on them. I was watching my uncle, Robert Carter, the man who had ruled our family for decades with money and intimidation. He had always been untouchable, the self-anointed patriarch. And now, seated at the defense table, Robert's expression collapsed. The smug mask slipped right off his face, replaced by the hollow shock of a man watching a ghost enter the room. For him, I wasn't supposed to exist in this context. I was supposed to be the dropouts, the family embarrassment, the 1 cent for coffee runs. He thought he had buried me under years of belittling remarks and dismissive laughs. Only 2 hours earlier, his face had looked very different. Out in the polished hallway, surrounded by relatives, Robert had basked in the attention. His confidence radiated. He was sure he'd walk free from his federal wire fraud trial. He was telling jokes, shaking hands, and my family clung to his aura of power like moths to light. And me? I stood slightly apart, like I always did. I'd grown comfortable with that role, the quiet niece, the one who blended into wallpaper. It was easier than constantly defending myself against their sideways glances and whispered pity. That's when my mother, Linda Carter, leaned close. Her perfume was familiar, comforting in a way, but her words carried the same undertone I had heard all my life. "Emily, dear, could you be useful and bring your uncle some water? All this waiting must be so boring for you." It wasn't really a request. It was a reminder of my place. I was there to serve, to be helpful in meaningless ways while the important ones handled the real matters. Robert overheard, of course. He always did when there was an opportunity to humiliate me. He barked out a laugh that bounced across the marble walls. "Leave her be. What would a college dropout know about a federal courthouse anyway? Probably thinks it's like one of those TV dramas she watches." The sting was familiar. His words always left bruises that never quite healed. But this time, something shifted. At that exact moment, Attorney Parker walked by. She didn't break stride, but her eyes flicked to mine, steady and unreadable. And in that single glance, everything changed. My uncle thought he had reduced me again, crushed me down into invisibility. But in Parker's eyes, I saw recognition, not of the dropout, not of the failure, but of the deputy marshal whose work had already helped build the very case against him. Robert didn't know. He had no idea that the niece he mocked had spent nights in briefing rooms, had led operations where hesitation meant death, had written reports that prosecutors relied on. To him, I was still just the family's ghost, a reminder of what they considered wasted potential. But here in this courthouse, in front of the judge and jury, I wasn't invisible anymore. I remember standing straighter, my uniform invisible under civilian clothes but burning against my skin like armor. The family ledger I kept in my head, the one filled with every slight, every dismissal, clicked forward another tally. But this time, it didn't hurt. This time, it fueled me. And as the courtroom rustled with whispers, and my uncle sat frozen in disbelief, I realized something. This wasn't just family business anymore. This was war. If there was ever a holiday that reminded me of how invisible I was in my own family, it was Thanksgiving in Indianapolis at my Uncle Robert's sprawling suburban home. The house smelled of turkey and wine, with the kind of forced cheer that never reached beneath the surface. Robert held court at the head of the table, his booming laugh shaking the chandelier. His pride and joy, his son Jason Carter, my cousin, sat at his right hand, flashing the grin of a man who had never once worried about paying rent or proving himself. Jason wore confidence like it was his birthright, because in this family, it was. I sat near the end of the table, across from my mother, Linda. She gave me that soft smile of hers, the one that always looked more like an apology than affection. After dinner, Robert stood with his glass raised high. "I have an announcement," he declared, his voice loud enough to rattle the silverware. "As of Monday, our Jason is the newest junior partner at Carter and Finch Development." The room erupted in applause. My aunts clapped, my cousins cheered, and my mother dabbed her eyes with a napkin. Jason basked in it, nodding modestly as if this promotion hadn't been handed to him on a silver platter. Everyone knew it wasn't merit, it was inheritance dressed as achievement. And me? I sat in silence, the clapping echoing like a drumbeat in my chest. The ledger in my mind tallied again, another entry for the effortless triumphs of Jason, the golden son. Another reminder of how easily my own struggles were dismissed. Still, in a rare surge of courage, I tried to step out of the shadows. When the room finally quieted, I cleared my throat. "I actually have some news too," I said, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. "I just finished my advanced certification at FLEC, the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers." The words hung in the air for a split second before Robert's smile spread, wide and dripping with condescension. "Oh, that's adorable," he cooed, his tone sharp enough to slice through bone. "Another little certificate for the wall. Very nice, Emily." He gave my shoulder a patronizing pat, then turned immediately back to Jason. "Now, Jason was just telling me about a 7-figure deal he's closing. Incredible instincts, this kid." And just like that, the conversation pivoted back to him, my words erased as if I had never spoken. I sat there, swallowed by silence, the room buzzing with excitement over Jason's new role. My heart pounded, my hands clenched under the table. That heavy, familiar weight pressed down on me again, the suffocating realization that, to them, I would never be enough. But what none of them knew, what they couldn't even imagine, was that only a week later I would be standing in a different room, commanding the attention of seasoned law enforcement officers. It was a tactical operations center, sterile and humming with low lights. Blueprints glowed on monitors. Surveillance feeds flickered. The air buzzed with the tension of an imminent raid. And there I was, Deputy U.S. Marshal Emily Carter, at the head of the room, briefing a joint task force. "The fugitive is barricaded inside a fortified residence," I explained, pointing to the highlighted section of the floor plan. "Team Alpha will breach from the north. Expect armed resistance. Communications will run on the encrypted network. Primary objective: capture. Secondary: secure all digital records under Title 21. We move at 0500. Every set of eyes was on me. Not a single one dismissed me. Not one person asked me to fetch water or compared me to a TV drama. My commanding officer, Chief Deputy Hayes, listened intently, his weathered face unreadable until the briefing ended. Then, he gave a single, decisive nod. Solid plan, Carter. Execute. That single acknowledgement meant more than every ounce of my family's applause for Jason combined. In that room, I wasn't invisible. I wasn't the dropout. I was trusted. Essential. Real. And yet, back at the Thanksgiving table, none of them had the slightest clue. Jason leaned back, his laugh filling the room, while Robert poured another glass of wine. My mother looked at me with pity, her silence cutting deeper than words. I smiled faintly, though, because deep inside, I knew something they didn't. One day, the same girl they dismissed would be the one who ended Robert's empire. And when that day came, they wouldn't just see me. They'd never forget me. A few days before the trial was set to close, my phone lit up with my mother's name. I knew before I answered what the call would sound like. Her voice always carried the weight of family politics, wrapped in softness like a blade hidden in velvet. "Emily, honey," as she began, her words frayed at the edges. "I heard you've been at the courthouse. You know how your Uncle Robert is. He's just from a different generation, where a college degree meant everything. He doesn't mean to hurt you. He's just under a lot of stress with this trial." I said nothing, letting her spin the same excuses she had offered all my life. Every insult, every dismissal, every time I was told to sit quietly while Jason was celebrated, she had always found a way to justify it. And then came the line I knew was coming. The one that always landed like a punch to the gut. "Please, Emily, just be the bigger person." I closed my eyes. Those words had become the family anthem. Be the bigger person. Don't answer back. Don't challenge. Don't make it worse. Just swallow it down until you become so small you nearly disappear. But this time, something in me crystallized. Cold, clear, immovable. They would never see me. To them, being the bigger person meant I had to shrink. To vanish. And I was done vanishing. When the call ended, I set the phone on my desk and stared at it until the quiet of the room settled into me. My mother's words had always carried weight before, shackling me to a role I never chose. But now, I felt something shift. The years of swallowing hurt, of biting my tongue, of waiting for even a scrap of recognition, it all hardened into resolve. Robert had dismissed me one too many times. And in dismissing me, he had made a mistake. A tactical mistake. This wasn't about family anymore. This was about procedure. About law. About justice. The next morning, I requested a meeting with Assistant U.S. Attorney Parker. I didn't walk into her office as the quiet niece. I walked in as Deputy U.S. Marshal Emily Carter, with intelligence that could dismantle Robert's carefully constructed defenses. Her office was tidy, sunlight streaming across neat stacks of files. Parker looked up from her desk, her gaze sharp, weighing me in an instant. "What do you have for me, Marshal?" she asked, her tone clipped but not unkind. I sat down, my voice even. The defendant believes he's untouchable. His financial world is layered in shell corporations and legal firewalls. His lawyers have been careful. They're good. But, I leaned forward, he has one weakness. Parker's eyes narrowed slightly, inviting me to continue. His ego. He documents his own crimes. I explained how Robert had always kept private ledgers, handwritten, meticulous records of his most fraudulent deals. To him, they weren't incriminating files. They were trophies, proof of his brilliance. He stored them not in his office or his banks, but at home, locked in a wall safe hidden behind a painting in his study. I gave her the make, the model, the location. This wasn't gossip. This wasn't family drama. This was a professional target profile. Parker didn't interrupt. She just listened, her eyes scanning me like she was recalibrating her understanding of who I was. And when I finished, she gave a single nod. A warrant citing specific digital and paper records at that location could be fruitful, she said. Then, with deliberate weight, a thank you, Marshal Carter. She didn't call me Emily. She didn't pat me on the head with empty sympathy. She used my title. And in that moment, I wasn't a ghost. I wasn't invisible. I was an asset. A few days later, I received an encrypted one-line message, search executed. Evidence secured. The team, deliberately chosen to avoid conflict of interest, had cracked the safe. Inside, they found the ledgers. Dozens of them, filled with Robert's own handwriting. Every fraudulent transfer, every shell company detail. Every boastful diary of crimes he thought no one would ever uncover. It was the smoking gun. My role shifted overnight. I was no longer the quiet niece in the gallery. I was the key witness, the deputy marshal who could authenticate the evidence that would dismantle him piece by piece. And as the trial neared its end, my family still sat smugly in the pews, convinced Robert would walk free. They whispered, smiled, gave each other reassuring nods. But I sat quietly at the back, calm for the first time in years. Because I knew what they didn't. The final chapter hadn't been read yet. And I was about to read it for them. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet confidence on the defense's side. My Uncle Robert leaned back in his chair, giving his attorneys the smug nod of a man who believed he had already won. My mother smiled faintly, my cousins whispered to one another, and the Carter family gallery seemed wrapped in a cocoon of certainty. They had no idea. Then, Assistant U.S. Attorney Parker stood. The simple act seemed to draw the air out of the room. Her posture was firm, her expression unreadable. Your Honor, she said, her voice crisp, as the prosecution calls one final rebuttal witness. A flicker of annoyance crossed Robert's face. His attorney leaned over, whispering something, clearly irritated that the government was trying to drag things out. Parker let the silence stretch before continuing. This witness will testify to the provenance of Exhibit 12, the defendant's private ledgers. Robert's jaw twitched. He knew no one should have been able to speak to those books. No one but him. And then Parker turned, her gaze sweeping the gallery, landing on me. The prosecution summons Deputy U.S. Marshal Emily Carter to the stand. For a moment, the silence was deafening. Then, a ripple of whispers broke out across my family's row. Emily, and my mother gasped, clutching her pearls. A character witness, my aunt hissed. And from Jason, my cousin, the golden child, Robert's pride, I heard the words that had defined my life. Why are they calling the Dwarpite? The murmurs grew frantic. They were trying to make sense of it, to fit this moment into the narrative they had written for me. But the pieces refused to connect. The clerk's booming voice cut through the chaos. Will Deputy Marshal Carter please approach the stand? I rose. Every head in the courtroom turned. I let my gaze sweep briefly over my family, their shock, their confusion, their disbelief. Then I reached up and unbuttoned my blazer. I slid it from my shoulders and let it fall onto the bench. Gasps echoed like gunfire. There, gleaming on my belt, was the silver badge of the U.S. Marshal Service, alongside the dark, steady weight of my holstered firearm. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. Jason stared, wide-eyed. And Robert, my uncle, the patriarch, the man who had spent a lifetime cutting me down, sat frozen, his face drained of color. This image was so far outside their reality that they couldn't process it. To them, I had always been the ghost of the family. Now, I was standing in full view as something they never believed possible. I walked deliberately to the witness stand, each footstep echoing against the polished floor. Every step felt like a reclamation, like I was leaving behind the invisible girl they had boxed me into and stepping fully into the life I had built. My posture was straight. My eyes were forward. I didn't look at them again. When I reached the stand, I placed my hand on the Bible. My voice was steady as I swore the oath. The judge, his expression formal but respectful, looked at me. Marshal Carter, he said, the title ringing across the courtroom. Thank you for being here. The contrast struck me like lightning. For years, I had been dismissed, diminished, pitted. Now, in the place that mattered most, I was addressed with dignity, with respect. My testimony wasn't emotional. It wasn't about family betrayal or hurt feelings. It was procedural, precise, devastating. I explained the warrant, the specific intelligence that led to the safe, the unbroken chain of custody of the ledgers. I spoke in the language of my profession, a language my family had never realized I spoke. Through it all, I could feel Robert's eyes on me. The patriarch, the self-proclaimed king of the Carters, sat frozen, watching his empire unravel at the hands of the niece he had called useless. His arrogance, his power, his narrative, it all disintegrated under the fluorescent lights as I calmly outlined how his own hand had incriminated him. The defense squirmed. The jury listened intently. And my family? They looked at me as if I were a stranger. But I wasn't a stranger. I was the same girl they had dismissed, mocked, ignored. The difference was that now, for the first time, they had no choice but to see me. When I stepped down from the stand, the courtroom was silent. The Carter family dynasty had cracked. Robert sat pale and broken. And I felt no triumph, no vindictive joy. Only a profound sense of release. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to be seen by them. I already knew exactly who I was. The hours that followed blurred together, but one moment burned itself into my memory like a brand: the verdict. The courtroom was so still you could hear the scratch of the clerk's pen as he handed the slip of paper to the foreman. Robert sat at the defense table, his jaw clenched, his confidence barely holding. He shot a reassuring glance toward my mother, who returned it with a fragile smile. Jason leaned forward, his posture radiating the same arrogance he had inherited from his father. I sat in the back row, my hands folded in my lap, calm as I had ever been. When the foreman stood, he didn't look at Robert. That's how I knew. On count one, the foreman said, voice steady, guilty. The word struck like a hammer. My mother flinched. Jason's mouth fell open. Robert's shoulders stiffened. On count two, guilty. The repetition was relentless. Each pronouncement was another nail in the coffin of Robert's empire, another crack in the foundation of the Carter family's illusion of superiority. By the time the last count was read, my uncle no longer resembled the man who had strutted through family gatherings like a king. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The weight of the truth, undeniable, documented in his own hand, had crushed him. The judge dismissed the jury. The court adjourned. The gavel struck wood, sharp and final. And just like that, the Carter family dynasty was gone. My relatives sat frozen in the gallery, unable to move, their expressions a mix of disbelief and shame. My mother stared at the floor, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jason just sat in silence, the shine of his unearned confidence finally stripped away. They weren't the proud, untouchable clan they had always pretended to be. They were simply the family of a convicted felon. I should have felt triumph. I should have felt vindication. For years, I had dreamed of this moment, of watching Robert lose everything he had used to diminish me. But sitting there, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something far quieter. Pity. Robert had spent his life chasing power, chasing admiration, chasing the illusion of invincibility. And now, stripped of all of it, he was just a man. A small, broken man who had underestimated the wrong person. As the marshals led him away, his wrists bound in handcuffs, he turned his head once, his eyes locking with mine. There was no rage there, no arrogance. Just the haunted recognition that I had been the one to undo him. And I met his gaze without blinking. When he disappeared through the courtroom doors, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The family sat in silence. No one spoke to me. No one asked questions. No one acknowledged what had just happened. They were too wrapped in their own disbelief, their own humiliation. But as the crowd began to thin, two figures cut through it, Assistant U.S. Attorney Parker and Chief Deputy Hayes. Parker extended her hand, her grip firm. "Couldn't have done it without your intel, Marshal," as she said simply. Her eyes carried no pity, only professional respect. Beside her, Hayes gave me the smallest of smiles. For him, that was rare, precious currency. "Good work, Carter," he said, his voice gravelly but warm. Their words settled into me like armor. Stronger than any applause my family had ever given Jason. Because this was real. Earned. True. As they walked me out of the courtroom, I didn't look back. Behind me, my family still sat, stunned, trapped in their self-made silence. They hadn't lost just Robert, they had lost the illusion that had held them together. And for me, I felt something I had never felt in their presence before. Freedom. 6 months after the verdict, I found myself standing in front of a door with a new plaque. The brass still gleamed, polished and freshly mounted. Senior Deputy U.S. Marshal E. Carter, Task Force Lead. For a long moment, I just stared at it. It was more than a title. It was proof. Not for my family, not for the world, but for me. Inside, the conference room buzzed with the low hum of conversation. I stepped in, and a dozen heads turned toward me. Men and women from across the service, some younger, some hardened veterans with lines carved deep into their faces. They straightened as I entered, not out of fear, but respect. I took my place at the head of the table. "All right," I began, my voice steady. "We've got a fugitive recovery up crossing state lines. Everyone needs to be sharp. No mistakes. The room quieted, every set of eyes on me. Not one carried condescension. Not one carried pity. They weren't waiting for me to fail. They trusted me. They needed me. That was my family now. And the thing about family built in the fire of the job was that it didn't care about bloodlines or last names. It was forged in risk, in trust, in knowing that the person beside you would run into danger without hesitation because you would do the same for them. Weeks later, after a grueling multi-state operation that ended in a high-stakes capture in Dallas, we ended up at a dimly lit bar. The air was thick with the smell of fried food and laughter. My team filled the booths, sharing stories, ribbing each other, trading war tales only those who had lived them could truly understand. I sat among them, a cold beer in my hand, and for the first time in years, I felt it, home. Not the home I had grown up in, not the Carter family house where silence and pity defined my existence. This was different. This was chosen. Chief Deputy Hayes slid into the booth across from me. He didn't smile much, but tonight there was a glimmer in his eyes. "You've done good, Carter," he said simply, lifting his glass. The team echoed him with cheers, raising theirs. My chest tightened, not with hurt, not with longing, but with something I hadn't felt since childhood. Belonging. I realized then that I had stopped keeping score. That mental ledger I had carried for years, the one filled with Robert's insults, my mother's excuses, Jason's unending triumphs, it was gone. Balanced. Paid in full. I didn't need their recognition anymore. I didn't even want it. I had found something better. Still, the past had a way of knocking on your door when you least expected it. Late one night, I was finishing a pre-op report in my office. The glow of the desk lamp painted everything in warm amber, the quiet broken only by the scratch of my pen. My phone buzzed. A single notification lit the screen. It was a message from my mother. "Emily, your uncle was sentenced today. 10 years. We never understood. I'm so sorry." I read it once. Then again. I waited for the rush of anger, the sting of old wounds, the spark of triumph. But none of it came. There was only stillness. The calm of a sea after a storm. Her apology, the one I had once craved more than anything, was just words now. Empty, fragile words. They couldn't touch me anymore. I held my finger over the screen for a moment, then tapped archive. Gone. For the first time, I understood what peace actually felt like. My family had spent years telling me my value depended on a degree, on fitting their mold. But here, in this life I had built, I finally understood the truth. Value isn't framed on a wall. It's proven in the field. It's sworn on the stand. And in the company of my new family, the ones who saw me clearly from the start, I knew I had finally come home. After I archived my mother's message, I sat in my office in silence. The lamp cast a golden glow across the desk, and the city lights beyond the window shimmered like distant constellations. For the first time in years, I felt untethered. It struck me how many nights I had spent replaying old conversations in my head, Robert's mocking laugh, Jason's smug grins, my mother's whispered commands to be useful. I had memorized every slight, every look, every dismissal, carrying them like stones in a backpack that grew heavier with every passing year. But now, that weight was gone. I hadn't noticed it falling away, not at first. Maybe it started in the courtroom, when the judge addressed me as Marshal Carter. Maybe it was when Parker shook my hand with professional respect, or when Hayes nodded at me like an equal. Maybe it was the night at the bar, laughing with my team until my ribs hurt. Wherever it had begun, it ended here, in this quiet room, with a single archived text. For years, I had craved acknowledgement from people who were never capable of giving it. I had chased validation from a family that had built its identity on dismissing me. And now I realized the truth. I didn't need them to see me anymore. I already saw myself. The irony was sharp. My family had spent so long convinced that a college diploma defined my worth. They saw me as a dropout, a failure. But in the end, it wasn't a piece of paper that broke Robert's empire. It was me. My training. My persistence. My oath. The law recognized me in a way my blood never had. The following week, I walked into the task force headquarters and was greeted not with pity, but with nods of respect. A young deputy, barely out of training, approached me after a briefing. His hands shook slightly as he held out a file. "Marshal Carter," he said, his voice low but sincere, "I just want to thank you. The way you led that Dallas operation, it saved lives." His eyes held the same mix of nerves and admiration I had once directed toward Hayes when I was starting out. In that moment, I realized something profound. I wasn't just building a new life for myself. I was shaping the path for others. I was becoming the kind of leader I had once desperately needed. That night, I sat at home with a cup of coffee, watching the steam curl upward. My apartment wasn't grand, nothing like Robert's flashy mansion had been, but it was mine. The quiet here was different than the silence I'd grown up with. This wasn't the silence of being ignored or erased. This was peace. My phone buzzed again, another message from my mother. "Emily, I wish things could have been different. I wish we had understood sooner." I stared at it for a long while before setting the phone face down. The old me would have typed back something desperate, seeking closure, begging for recognition. But the woman I had become no longer needed to fill that void. Sometimes, peace doesn't come from fixing the past. It comes from walking away from it. The next morning, as the sun rose over Chicago, I walked into headquarters to lead another briefing. My team was already gathered, waiting. Their chatter quieted as I stepped inside. I wasn't invisible here. I wasn't the dropout or the disappointment. I was exactly who I was meant to be. The day after Robert's sentencing was announced publicly, the calls began. First my mother, then my aunt, then even Jason. I ignored them all. By the third day, I came home to find an envelope slipped under my apartment door. My mother's handwriting curled across the front, "For Emily." I stood there for a long moment before opening it. Inside was a letter, handwritten, her words shaky. "Emily, I don't know how to bridge the distance between us anymore. We never saw you for who you were. We were blinded by Robert's shadow, by the stories we told ourselves about success and failure. I am sorry. Please, if nothing else, remember that I love you." I traced the letters with my finger. For years, I had wanted these words. I had imagined them as a kind of salvation, that if she ever admitted her mistakes, the years of pain would dissolve. But now that they were here, on paper, I felt only quiet detachment. Because apologies, even sincere ones, cannot undo decades of dismissal. That weekend, my mother showed up at the task force office. She wasn't allowed inside, of course, but one of the deputies told me she was waiting outside. Against my better judgment, I stepped out. She stood on the sidewalk in a long coat, her eyes tired but hopeful. "Emily," as she said softly, her voice cracking. "You look so strong." I folded my arms, bracing myself. "Why are you here, Mom?" I wanted to see you. To tell you I'm proud." She hesitated. "And to ask if maybe we could start over?" Her words hit me like a strange echo. Start over. As if the years of silence and dismissal could be erased with a fresh coat of paint. I shook my head. "You don't need to be proud of me. You don't need to make this right. I've already built a life that doesn't depend on your approval." Her face crumpled. "But I'm your mother. I love you." I felt a sting of tears in my own eyes but steadied my voice. "You love the idea of me, the version that stayed small and safe, the one you could manage. But you never loved the real me. Not until now, when it's too late." She reached for my arm, but I stepped back. "Emily, please." No, my tone was firm but not cruel. "I'm done being the bigger person. I'm done waiting to be seen. I've already found the people who see me." Her lips trembled. "Your team?" I nodded. "Yes. My team. They're my family now. A family that doesn't ask me to shrink. A family that doesn't measure my worth by a piece of paper or by how useful I am to someone else's ego." She started to cry, and for a moment, I wanted to fold into her arms, to let myself be the daughter again. But then I remembered all the Thanksgivings, all the whispered commands, all the time she had stood by Robert's side while I was belittled. I couldn't go back. "I hope you find peace, Mom," I said softly. "But I've already found mine." And with that, I turned and walked back inside the building, leaving her on the sidewalk. When the door closed behind me, the noise of the office filled my ears, laughter, the shuffle of papers, the familiar energy of people preparing for the work ahead. I breathed deeply, letting it wash over me. This was my world now. I didn't look back. Months passed. Seasons turned. The trial and the verdict faded from the headlines, but in my family, I knew the silence remained. I never heard from Jason again. My aunts and uncles stopped trying to call. My mother sent occasional letters, each one shorter than the last, until they stopped altogether. And I didn't chase them. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel compelled to fix what was broken. I had something better. My days began before sunrise in the task force headquarters. Maps pinned on walls, photographs spread across tables, tactical gear lined up like soldiers waiting to move. My voice filled briefing rooms where others once ignored me. Men and women listened when I spoke, their trust in me hard-earned and real. That trust was my anchor. One evening, after a long raid that ended without casualties, we gathered again at that same dim bar in Chicago. The jukebox hummed in the background, laughter spilled from our booth, and the smell of grease and spilled beer hung thick in the air. Someone cracked a joke about my sergeant glare, and the table erupted in laughter. I leaned back, listening to them, watching them. And I realized something with a kind of quiet awe. I had built a new family, not from blood, but from grit. From loyalty. From respect. This was the family that clapped for my victories without comparison. The family that never asked me to shrink. The family that saw me not as an inconvenience, but as a leader. That night, I walked home through the Chicago streets, the city alive with its constant pulse. Lights glowed against the river, cars hummed past, and the air was cool with the hint of rain. I paused on a bridge, leaning against the railing, staring at the reflection of the skyline rippling in the water. The Emily my family had known, the one they had labelled a dropout, a disappointment, was gone. She had been shed like an old skin. The Emily who remained was someone they had never been willing to see. A soldier. A marshal. A leader. I smiled, the kind of smile that comes when you finally make peace with the past. My family had thought a degree defined worth. But life had taught me a different truth. Worth isn't granted by a diploma, or applause, or the approval of people who never understood you. Worth is forged in choices. In actions. In the courage to stand tall even when no one believes in you. I didn't need their validation anymore. I didn't need their love to know who I was. Because I had my badge. I had my oath. I had my people. And that was enough. As I turned and walked home, the city lights glowing around me, I felt lighter than I ever had before. The ledger in my mind, the one I had carried for so long, was empty. Balanced. Closed. The Carter family story had ended. But mine was just beginning.